did take women a long time to get the right to vote, and now we have it. And then it's a freedom that we have as a democracy, and people have died for our freedoms. Right now, women are about 55% of the population. So think if all the women who could vote did vote, we could really make a difference.
That was Yvonne Wood, a true hero and advocate for women's rights and equality. Yvonne worked for years to build a lasting monument to celebrate the women's suffrage movement, and now on the heels of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, we hope she's basking in the afterglow of the amazing activities that were held in Nashville and planning her next strategy. This dynamo does not sit still for long. Yvonne has too many accolades to mention here, but her legacy and contributions toward making the voices of women heard and valued should not be underestimated. She has worked to create lasting leadership positions for women, gender balance on state boards and commissions, and long-lasting legacies such as this monument that will tell stories for years to come. In her spare time, if she has any, she owns Wood Conference and Event Planning.
I'm Sally Hussey, the CEO of 50 Forward, and we elected to launch this podcast because we know older adults have such inspiring stories and wisdom worth sharing. We have now all learned that social connections are critical to our well-being. This podcast is made possible by 50 Forward, the leading resource for adults 50 plus in Middle Tennessee who seek to live longer, more fulfilling lives.
You are listening to Squeeze the Day, where we talk to extraordinary people over the age of 50 who are living their best life now. Their stories are both inspiring and encouraging to all of us as we seek to navigate a meaningful and purpose-driven second chapter of life. So let's get started. Welcome, Yvonne. This year, Tennessee celebrated being the state that gave the final vote to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. That was 100 years ago. What was your role in that celebration?
Well, I guess I would say that my major role was planning the dedication of the Tennessee Woman Suffrage Monument. My role really started when Alma Sanford invited me to serve on that 9-member board. And the Tennessee Woman Suffrage Monument Board actually raised over $900,000 in private funds during the past 12 years so that we could plan to bring attention to Tennessee and the women who fought so hard in 1920 for women to get the right to vote. We had traveled around the country prior to that, and anytime suffrage came up, we noticed that Tennessee was never mentioned. And we thought that was very odd. And of course, being Tennesseans, we thought it was very sad that Tennessee's pivotal role was really never mentioned. So our plan was to call attention to that and to recognize that. So we decided that a monument would be perhaps the best thing to do. So we raised those private funds in order to plan what we were going to do, and that was to have a monument and then to commission the artist once we decided that's what we were going to do, and that was Alan LeQuire. So we commissioned him to do it. So this year, on August the 18th, getting back to what I said my major role was, it really was like 12 years in the making, but this year it was the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote, winning the right to vote, I should say. And so we had the monument and the dedication of the monument at Centennial Park, and we officially donated that monument to the city of Nashville.
So can you tell us a little bit about the suffrage monument itself? What was your vision? When did the efforts begin? And who are the women commemorated in that statue?
Well, as I said, we wanted to bring honor to those suffragists who fought so hard for us to win the right to vote. And Carrie Chapman Catt, who's the national president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, is on the monument. And Alice Dudley from Nashville, probably the major leader in the Tennessee effort is on the monument. Sue Shelton White from Jackson, Tennessee, an attorney. She was the youngest suffrage at the time in 1920 on the monument. And Abby Crawford Milton of Chattanooga. And then we had an African American woman, Frankie Pierce of Nashville. Now, Frankie was not a white suffragist at the time because in 1920 there were groups of black suffragists and they had their own groups and white suffragists who had their own groups. But the interesting thing is that the black suffragists couldn't be on the white suffragists or in the white suffragist group. But Frankie Pierce was such a leader in the Nashville area, especially, and she was a great help. And so that's why she's represented on the monument because of all of the influence she had and the help that she gave to the other suffragists. But as I said, the women who are on the monument were there in 1920 and were part of lobbying the legislators in Tennessee to ratify the amendment.
What a fabulous representation. I know that fundraising efforts for the monument must have been pretty difficult when you started. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes, that's always, fundraising is always not an easy thing to do. And I never really fancied myself to be a good fundraiser because I never really liked to ask people for money. But I'll have to say that if you're ever going to be a fundraiser, you need to have a project that people want to be involved in as much as people wanted to be involved in being part of a monument. So, especially one where, the benefits would be good. So, to talk about and tell you how we decided and what we decided to do, Pat Pierce of Harriman, and I know that some of you know Pat, is a member of our board, and she and I were co-chairs of the fundraising effort. And so I remember saying to Pat, this is about women. This monument is about women. And I really do want women to be involved in donating the funds for this monument. And, I don't want us to arrive at the day that we're going to dedicate the monument and there just be like 3 or 4 major donors there. And I just envisioned that there's just going to be, hundreds and hundreds of women. Well, I didn't envision the pandemic, unfortunately, but that was my feeling. And Pat agreed with me. And so we came up with the idea to have a society. And, I said, if you have something that is really hard to get into and there's just going to be a limited number of people, it makes you want to be part of it more. And I said, the other thing is that you have great benefits in exchange for it. So we started trying to figure that out. And Pat said, well, why don't we have a society of only women and let's limit it to 200 and let's call it the Perfect 36 Society. And I thought that was a great idea. So we did that. And, we had a deadline. And by the deadline, we had the cutoff date. We had 220 women. And we let the extra 20 come in because they had mailed the check that was postmarked by the deadline date and so on. So, and then the benefits turned out to be, in that case, a reception at the governor's residence. And more importantly, their names engraved at the monument. And so their names would be there forevermore. So that was really a great benefit. And there were a few others. Then an interesting thing happened. Men wanted to be part of it too. They said, well, we want to be part of this too. And it was like, well, we don't want to discriminate against anybody, of course. And so we opened it up and we had the Yellow Rose Society. And then we had, almost 300 men and women to come in. And then there were a group in Memphis who were real fans of Representative Lois DeBerry, who's one of the political trailblazers on the monument. And so they then had their society where they called it the 5-5. And that's because her birthday is May the 5th. And so we had several more, less than 100. And then we did have, after that, major donors to come in And Paula Casey, who is a member of the Suffrage Monument from Memphis, really helped with the beginning of the larger donors. But she wasn't the only one, others did as well. And then we ended up with 5 major donors, and their names are at the monument as well. And then we ended up also with 19 organizations like the League of Women Voters, the Women's Political Caucus, and so on. And so that's how we raised the money, the societies, the large donors, and organizations. And then we had one major community benefactor, and that was the Hermitage Hotel.
What a tremendous effort. I'm curious, you mentioned Alan LeQuire earlier, and I'd like you to tell us a little bit about working with Alan and how you came about finding him and pulling him into this project.
Oh, well, that's a great question. Alan is just super. I knew about him, but I had never met him before getting involved with this, and I'm so glad that I've met him and his lovely wife Andre, who's also a great asset. I had read about him and knew that he had done the marvelous Athena. I think it's the largest indoor sculpture in the United States, and we all know, how really beautiful it is. Stands 42 feet and some odd inches tall, and like Nike in the one hand is 6 feet, and I'd always admired that. Well, some of the board members said, well, though, we really need to have a woman artist, naturally. And so we talked about that, and there was quite a bit of discussion back and forth because a couple of our board members were really strong that we needed to have a woman, and I could understand that. But as we went on and we saw the beautiful sculptures he had done already for monuments that are in East Tennessee and Knoxville, we just finally decided it had to be Alan, and I'm so glad that we did. He's very wonderful to work with. He's very laid back, but of course very, very creative. But he was patient with us as we all, 9 strong, independent thinking women wanted this, wanted that. So when we started talking about the number of women that we'd have on the monument, he'd say, well, that'll only cost you $100,000 more. So he knew how to make us come to a decision. He got down to, you can't afford all this. You just do what you can. But we got the really good representation, I think, of women on there. And actually, also, Alan has done 17 woman suffrage monuments now, and I think it means that he's done more woman suffrage monuments than anybody else in the country right now. But he's very talented and very experienced, so we listened to what he said, and we did it.
That's probably a very smart move. In a world where monuments are being challenged so much today, especially to have women celebrated for their role in history, how does that make you feel?
Well, it's really sad, isn't it? I don't think any of us like to see monuments defiled. However, I think we also at the same time understand how some monuments are offensive to some groups, especially in today's world. So it helps you understand why people would be unhappy. So I wish that we could find a way, and I think that people are discovering ways where instead of defiling them or tearing them down, that they can be maybe moved to places where they're not so offensive and in the wrong places, maybe like, the one that we might have at the Capitol where there's so much discussion about it and what should happen there. But with our own monument, of course, it bothers me to think about something happening there. But we tried to be very diverse in our choices. And we also have Trailblazer plaques of 3 women that are more contemporary women that we're calling political trailblazers and that are there. And they're not on the monument, but they're at the wall. And there's, plaques of theirs like photographs and bas relief type of Jane Eskin and Representative Lois DeBerry and also Beth Harwell. And these women represent the first in their categories. The first House Speaker, first statewide woman to win a statewide election, and the first Speaker pro tem of the House. And so we hope that people will understand what these represent and that they won't be offensive to any group. And we've got them in the park where there's some safety there, but if the worst happens, they'll just have to be cleaned or redone or whatever. But it is something that causes us all concern for various reasons.
You know, there were so many events tied to the 100th anniversary celebration here, and especially because the final vote and ratification happened here in Tennessee, that must make you be so proud.
Oh my gosh, it really has been rewarding. I mean, we went over some major hurdles. They're just stories that we could fill a book about what happened between the time we started and the time we were able to complete it. But I did love all of the activities that were going on leading up to the 100th anniversary, and especially the ones on August the 18th that were going on the same day. And, you know, at first I thought, oh my gosh, I wish we weren't all out there. And then I realized, no, this is really a great thing that we're all celebrating on the 18th, the day that the law was ratified. And it worked out really well. I mean, the things that were going on where they were doing reenactment over at the Capitol started an hour before ours did and was over when ours started. And then the ringing of the bells was when ours ended and that one was starting. And so it worked out really well. And it showed what a great interest we all had in woman suffrage. And that was really the point of it all anyway.
I'm really curious about your conversation with Tyler Boyd. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what that conversation was like?
Oh, well, I really love Tyler. The first time I actually met him, I was standing in line at the War Memorial Building to buy his book, and and the funny thing about it is that everybody was surrounding it, and it's just an incident that happened. Some woman I thought got in front of me. And I thought she didn't realize that she was getting in front of me. And I said, hey, wait a minute. And her name was Mary. I said, hey, wait a minute, Mary. You're stepping in front of me. And she said, oh, I'm sorry. She said, I was standing to the side and I didn't see you there. Well, it turned out that she was like the new person at the museum or the new person at somewhere. And we started having this big conversation. So glad to meet each other. And then when he handed me my autographed book, it said Mary, dear Mary. And so I thought that was so funny. So I said, well, not only did you get in front of me, but you got your book signed first. He was so embarrassed. So anyway, I handed it back to her and then he autographed mine. And then when I invited him to come and speak on the 18th, of course, everything was like we said was going on. He wanted to go over and see the reenactment. And so he was speaking, of course, for us too. So he said, don't worry, Yvonne, I'll be there on time. And he was. He got there on time. He got to see the reenactment and then got over to make his speech. But we didn't get to talk much then. But I have invited him to 2 different places to speak since we met that first funny day. And then him coming here, and then I've got him 2 more places to speak coming up after this, and he and I keep up by email a lot, so I like him a lot.
So tell us a little bit about who Tyler is, because he really is connected to Harry Byrne, who cast the final vote.
Yeah, he is the great grandnephew of Feb Byrne, who is Harry Byrne's mother. And Harry Byrne's mother played such an important part in the whole ratification of the amendment. So Tyler decided to write a book about his great I guess, granduncle. He would be Harry Byrne. And so that's who he is. And of course, Harry Byrne is the one who, the person, the representative, the youngest legislator. He was only 24, the youngest legislator in the General Assembly. And he cast the final vote on August the 18th. That broke the tie.
It's really nice to have a representative of the family who takes such a great interest, too, in the important role that his great granduncle played.
Right. I have to stop and think about it, too.
So Nashville received so much attention with the suffrage events, from the dedication of the statue to a women's vote exhibit at the library, and then a segment on CBS Sunday Morning. How did so much of that get so tied together and orchestrated on this one day?
Oh, well, there's always those great backstories, aren't there? And that's interesting too, because first thing is that we being the Woman Suffrage Board, we started saying, well, we've got this pandemic and what's going to happen with the virus. And what if if we made all these plans and we can't have it? So we said, well, we'll just hire somebody and do a virtual cast, and it would be a video that we can keep and show another time. And so we hired Stage Post, which is local videography in Nashville. That was the first thing we did. And then I heard that Channel 5 was going to be doing some covering of one of those others that I mentioned. I think it was the ringing of the bells. And I thought, well, they're after us. So I called the general manager of WTVF, Lynn Planninger, and asked her if they would consider covering ours, since they, could do it before they did the other. And she said, well, let me think about that. And so then she called me back a day or two later and said they had decided they'd cover it, the whole thing. And I said, oh, it won't just be a thing on the news then, a little piece, it'll be you cover the whole thing. And she said, yes. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. So I was just really so happy about that. And then the next thing I know, I'm getting an email from CBS Sunday Morning, and I was from a producer, and I was thrilled because that's my favorite show. And she wanted to know if they could come and cover it. And I said, well, let me just get my breath here. Yes, you can definitely come and cover it. And that would just be wonderful. And so they did. And then I assumed that Channel 5 locally had done it. And so I mentioned it to them, and they said, no, we're just as surprised as you are. And they were just as happy, that the national CBS was coming. And so then that was all I knew. And the day of the dedication, the people that I hadn't even talked to all showed up. Every broadcast, WSM came and Channel 17 came. And then, of course, we had the print media there, the Tennessean and some of the others. And my son and daughter were helping me. They were at the gate, and they came to me and they said, well, they're not on the list. Are you going to let them in? And I said, are you kidding? WSM? Yeah, let them in. And so they all came. And I really do honestly think it had a lot to do with the women skydivers. I think that for the media, think about it, for the media, that was a big attraction. Those women jumping 6,000 feet out of a plane and right down next to our monument. So I do think that in the beginning, I sent out, news advisories. And so they knew that they were going to be jumping there. And so that's the way all that came together. But we were really, really happy with the coverage.
That's amazing. So I'd like to know a little bit about your upbringing.
Oh, me. Well, my mother and father owned a family grocery store in Gallatin, Tennessee. And so I guess before I was in the first grade, they opened it up. And then as I was growing up, I worked in the store and I learned a lot. I mean, you really learn a lot meeting the public that way as you're growing up. It's a good training ground. I worked in that grocery store all the way through my high school years till I left home. My mom and dad still owned it as I left home. But there was a lot of things that happened in that particular time that really, of course, like any of us, make us into the people that we are.
Mm.
And our grocery store was in an area of town where we had as many African American customers as white customers. It was really about 50-50. And I saw a lot of things that I thought were injustices and things. And I was always questioning why.
Hmm.
So I learned a lot about cultures that most people in the segregated South didn't know as much about.
I'm curious about voting. When did you first vote, and what do you remember about that day?
Well, it was a long time ago. I was thinking about that. My very first vote, and I think it was my first one, was like I voted for John Kennedy, and it must have been in 1960. And I lived in Gallatin, so I voted at the election commission. That's where you went to vote in those days. I was excited about it, but my mom and dad really thought voting was important. I can just remember how much emphasis they placed on how important. They were always urging people to vote, and it made me grow up thinking how important it was.
What would you say drives you to make a difference in community?
Well, I was always a person who questioned things. I guess a lot of us do. You're asked, why is that? I think that it really put a drive into me. You wonder, I began to wonder, was I born with it? Because I was just always hated injustices. And when I was growing up in that grocery store, I had some sort of a childhood disease that required me having a pediatrician. And the pediatrician that my mother chose was in Nashville and we were in Gallatin. And so in those days, I remember my mother taking me a time or two, but she was working in the store and she ended up sending me as a child with a black lady who worked for us. She was a really bright woman. Her name was Katie, and I loved her to death. And she worked like at our house and helped out, and at the store and helped out. And so my mother sent me to the pediatrician in Nashville with Katie. And I had to sit at the back of the bus with Katie because she had to sit there and she couldn't sit up where everybody else did. And I remember like maybe going to matinees. I wanted to go and mother would let me go and I would sit up in the balcony with Katie because that's where the black people sat. So I just saw those things and I questioned how this is just not right. So it was just one thing after another. And I just thought to myself, and then there was something that happened to me in my first job that I had that I think was really the thing that put the fire in me to be an advocate for women. I think it was the tipping point. I was like the secretary to the manager of a bank. And I was really young. I was just really only 18 at the time because what happened with me is that I went to work right out of high school and then I got my formal education later, like at night and weekends. And so I was working as his secretary and I saw all of the private information about salaries and everything because of who he was. And so we had an opening for a chief teller at the bank, and the woman who was leaving, her name was Willie, but she was, the chief teller, and she was leaving, and so she had to train the person who came in. And I know you can hear it coming. A man got the job, and when I saw the salary, he was making more than double what she made, and she had trained him, and he was brand new. So I go into my boss's office and I said, I have a question. And then I asked him about that. And he said, well, that's just the way it is. And I said, but that's not right. And he said, well, he's the breadwinner of the family. And I said, well, I'm working and my husband works. And I said, I'm not working for the fun of it. I'm working because it takes my salary and my husband's salary for us to pay our bills. And I said, so it just isn't right that a woman has to know this much, and it's just not right. And he patted me on the head. He literally did. And he said, honey,
Goodness.
that's just the way it is.
Hmm.
And I just thought to myself, I'll never forget it. I thought right then, this is not right. And I am going to do whatever I can to change this. And I kept that vow that if I was thinking, if I ever am in a place where I can make a difference, I will. And as my career went on and as I moved up, and got more education and therefore got better positions and had staff reporting and working for me, I always put a qualified woman in the position or promoted them or got salary increases for them or let them go to school and work part time, whatever it took. I kept that vow. And I have a lot of cards and letters and people thanking me for doing those things. That was the tipping point.
What a legacy. And I know that you've won many accolades over the years. I'm curious, is there one that stands out to you that makes you stand proudest?
Well, I do appreciate everything. I really think women should be honored more. You know, when you think about how many statues there are for men and how many for women. And I always have said, whatever we can do to honor women and to help them, we need to do that because there's a need. And so I've always appreciated any recognition that I've gotten personally. Of course, I think of maybe a couple or three. The Athena Award in Nashville really meant a lot to me, and the reason is because it's selected by your peers. And really what it stands for, the missions, the goals of everything are the things that I think people should be doing anyway, but when they do and they get recognized for it, then I think that's great. And the other one is also by your peers. It's the Molly Todd Cup that Cable gives, and it's a recognition for women who do things that change the world for the better. And so it meant a lot to me to get that award. And the other one was sort of a professional one. I had my own company that I started after I retired from state government, my meeting planning company. I got the Small Businesswoman of the Year award from NABO, and that really meant a lot to me. So I'd say those.
Congratulations on all of that success. I'm curious too. We understand that the bells across America rang upon ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, but they didn't ring in Tennessee. So this year, when the bells rang, how did that make you feel?
Well, it made me feel really, really wonderful that we finally got to ring the bells. And of course, I've already mentioned several times that the 100th anniversary of the law passing was on August the 18th. Of 1920. So it was really that back in the day, all the bells were actually rung on August the 26th in 1920 because Carrie Chapman Catt had been down in Tennessee, as we know. But when she got back and when it was finally all through the national level, and the Secretary of State, the National Secretary of State, had signed it, all the bells rang, but they didn't in Tennessee. And the reason they didn't in Tennessee is that because everybody was so stunned when Harry Byrne cast his vote, which was the one vote that broke the tie. They had three roll calls, and the first and second one had been tied at 48-48, and then he broke it at 49-48, and then Seth Walker came in. He had been very much against it, but he wanted to pull a legislative trick. So he, at the end, when he saw what was happening, he told him to change his vote to yes, under legislative rules, you can call to be reconsidered if you've been on the yes side. And so that's what he thought he was going to do. But as it turned out, he only had 72 hours to get that done. So, long story short, he tried every trick in the book, even down to them trying to say that Harry Byrne was bribed. And so all the Seth Walker fans and himself came up with the idea that they would say that he took a bribe. And then they had people that were going to say they witnessed it. But it turned out this was ironic. The stenographer who was taking the notes was really a suffragist. And so when she found out that they were going to tell this lie on Harry Byrne, she gave it to the Tennessean, that was a paper that was for the pro suffrage. And so they ran it in the paper that this fraud was going to happen. So it just ruined it. They couldn't do it when it was on the front pages. So he lost that battle. And they tried to do other things from a legal point of view through the courts, but his time ran out on him. But because there was so much tension, like that kind of thing, they didn't ring the bells in Nashville that year when everybody else was celebrating. So we rang the bells this year, and I think the group that is at the library that have the idea to ring the bells, that's just really a wonderful idea. And we stood at the monument at our dedication at noon on August the 18th in Nashville, was ringing their bells.
That is such an interesting historical story, and I'm just so proud of our state and what all you've accomplished recently with celebrating this big historic milestone.
Thank you, Susan.
So it took 70 years of activism to reach the point to ratify the amendment, but the state of Tennessee currently sees only about 53% of women going to the polls. Why do you think that is, and what is its impact on our society?
Oh, me. That's so sad, Susan. And actually, I think that right now, women registered voters are about 55% of the population. So think if all the women who could vote did vote, we could really make a difference, a good difference. It's hard because it did take women a long time to get the right to vote, and now we have it. And then it's a freedom that we have as a democracy, and people have died for our freedoms, and that's one of our major freedoms. And people should think about it, but I think sometimes people think that anything to do with politics is just, not important, it's a bad thing, or what difference does it make? It makes a lot of difference, of course, because from the time you get up in the morning till you go to bed at night, and even while you're sleeping, the laws that have been passed by representatives that we vote for are affecting our lives, either for a good way or for the bad way. And unfortunately, it's not always good. So we really do need to take our voting as being a God given right, a big responsibility, and should go to the polls and vote. But I sometimes too, and I don't want to place blame, but I think the 24/7 news that we have going on, it just turns people off sometimes. And there's just so many things, but I really do believe that men and women need to give serious thought to how important our voice in our government is, and how much it means not only to us but for the generations to follow us. It's really, really important.
I think with the huge presidential election around the corner, I keep wondering, is there something that you can think of that we can do to keep voting rights alive and people engaged?
It's so important because we see it's just under fire right now. We can't can't believe how much is going on to suppress the vote, it seems. And then, you have this pandemic on top of it. I think that all of us are just called upon to talk to our family, talk to our friends, doing what we're doing right now, any opportunities that we have to influence people and help them to understand. I really think our democracy, we're a republic that's a democracy, and I really think we're under threat more than maybe people realize. It's scary to me. So I really think that we should all just do everything we can think of course, we're going to vote, but to encourage others to vote. And like I was talking about my parents used to give rides to people to take them to the polls back in that day because a lot of people didn't have ways to get there. But still, if there's anything you can do to help somebody vote, if it's help them get their absentee ballot in, or taking them for a ride to a poll or whatever, anything we can do, we should do.
That's great advice. So I have a question now that we're asking all of our guests. What is the one piece of advice your parents gave you? Maybe at the time you thought it was silly, but now that phrase rings true or is a guiding principle in your everyday life.
Oh, my mom, as I said, my mom was sort of ahead of her time. She was a good businesswoman. And I mentioned we had a grocery store. Well, there was a grocery store on the corner right up from ours. I mean, it was like just a few hundred yards, and it wasn't even a football. I guess it was about 100 yards away. And they were competitors. And my mother told me, I was complaining about it one day, and she said, listen, competition is good for you. It keeps you on your toes. Competition is really a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And at the time, I really didn't agree with that. But as time has gone on, I see what good advice that is when you think about it. It was good advice. And then my dad was really, really a hard worker. And one of the things that he said to me that I've always remembered, he said that goodwill is greater to have than gold or treasure. And I think that is biblical, as a matter of fact. But he just said it to me in his words one day when we had the store. And he said, if you sell meat to somebody one day and it's good fresh meat, and they come back a few days later and tell you that the meat was bad, then you just give them more. You don't argue with them. The customer is always right. And I just frowned up. He said, goodwill is better to have. So I think he was right. Treat others as you want to be treated.
I'm with you. It sounds like you had fabulous role models. So I have one more question for you, and I'm curious, we're asking this of everyone related to the name of our program. What is it that you do to squeeze the day?
Is that sort of like seize the moment or something? Carpe diem. What I do is, first of all, I have to have a good cup of coffee. That's the first thing. That's the Kickstarter for me. I've really got to have that to get the day started. But then I think every day that I'm alive, I want to make it a good day. And I want to find the happiness and the positive side of things. Now, it's not like we don't all have bad days. We do. But I really do try to start the day with thinking good thoughts and trying to look at the positive side of things, especially when unexpected things happen that are getting me down. Then I tell my children, I say, I have to give myself a pep talk. And you do sometimes have to do that.
Agreed. I really want to say thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. That's been an amazing interview and so much interesting history and insight. We're grateful for your sharing.
Thank you. It's really been a lot of fun for me. We all like to talk about what we do and talk about ourselves, and now you're giving me an opportunity. It's great. Thank you.
Now we challenge everyone listening to go squeeze the day.